Welcome back. This is session 7, where we're going to be looking at how to communicate with someone who's got into difficulty with their substance use. I'm going to be offering you a range of ideas that other family members have found helpful, and I'll leave you to decide what, if any, of it is relevant to you that you may want to have a go at. Now, all these ideas are things just to experiment with, try them out, see if they work, if they don't work. If they do work, you might want to do them again. If they don't work, you might want to try something else. And I think also it's worth recognizing that a lot of the skills I'm going to be offering here are things to aspire to. Perhaps none of us are perfect at them. So it's more about finding skills to practice and just being good enough at them rather than thinking you have to be perfect. I'd like to start by just offering some general ideas to consider before you actually start talking to someone. So with that in mind, let's come on to the first slide. Before I start, I'd like to say that if trying out any of the ideas in this session feels too difficult, or you imagine feeling unsafe doing so, or they might increase any aggressive behaviour from your loved one, then we wouldn't want to advocate you trying that, obviously. Unless that is you've worked it through very carefully with others, preferably a professional, and have plans in place to ensure that you're not going to be at risk. I think the first thing to say is it's important to remember that you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You may be able to have influence on the person in your life, and they may be willing to sit down and talk with you, but you cannot make them do that, and you can't make them listen, nor can you make them be honest. I suggest that you aim to talk to them when they haven't used substances and are under the influence of them. Secondly, I suggest you aim for an attitude where you are respectful, both of yourself and for them. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to like what they say, you don't have to agree with them, and you don't have to say yes to something that you disagree with. I propose also that you think about aiming for a dialogue, not 2 monologues. Now, what I mean by that is that we listen as well as we speak. When we're in a true dialogue, we're both listening and speaking to the other person, and they similarly are also listening to us as well as speaking to us. The risk is very often, I think, that families get into having a monologue where both parties are just talking at each other without really listening. Now, as I've already said, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Therefore, the person that you're concerned about who's got into difficulty with their substance use, it may well be the case that they aren't willing to talk to you when they haven't used. They may not have respect for you. They may not be willing to have a dialogue. What I do suggest is that you keep doing these things even if they don't, unless of course you feel unsafe doing so. Okay, what I'd like to come on to next is to offer you some ideas to think about when it's your turn to speak. So let's come to the second slide. Okay, so here's some ideas for you to think about. First of all, be as honest as you feel able to be. Start what you say with I and not you, because it's easier for other people to hear. So notice the difference between I want you to do the washing up and you do the washing up. Notice how the second one sounds like an accusation, and that makes it harder to hear, and you're more likely to get a defensive response. And last, I suggest you talk about their behaviour, not about them as a person. So again, notice the difference between I feel angry when you haven't done the washing up for a week, rather than I'm angry at you for not washing up for a week. Again, it's often easy to hear, it sounds less like an accusation. Next, I'd like to offer you some ideas to consider when it's your turn to listen. The first point I'd like to make is when you listen is to really try and understand what they're saying to you. And to help you do that, I propose that you pause before you respond and just consider, have you understood what they're saying? Why does it matter to them? And have you understood the intention that they have behind what they're saying? This is important because often when we communicate with others, we get very focused on what someone's doing and their behaviour, And what we can miss is the intention that they have behind that. If you're not sure, just check. Then thirdly, I think it could be helpful just to acknowledge what it is that they've said. This helps them to know that you've heard them. These may well be things that you already do, but if they're not, then you may well find that they help you to understand what they're saying and also to show them that you've heard and understood what they've said. Okay, so what I want to share with you next are some communication skills that other family members have found helpful, and maybe there's something in these for you. So as I go through them, you might want to be noticing which ones appeal to you, maybe ones you'd like to have a go at, and perhaps there are some that don't, or maybe even ones that feel too difficult at this stage, and that's okay. The first thing I would like to say is that there is a theme running through many of these ideas, and that's to be assertive. And these ideas propose how to actually be assertive. Now, the first of these ideas is you have the right to say how you feel, such as, I feel frustrated you've used in the home again when I've asked you not to do that. Secondly, I think you have the right to ask for what you want rather than demand it or avoid asking, such as, I ask that you don't use illegal drugs in the house, please. Also, I believe you have the right to say no to something and to stop talking if you've had enough. The last point on this slide is being a stuck record. Now, this assertiveness technique is where you repeat something that's important for you to say, and that you do so respectfully of the other person. And this can be very useful if they're not responding to what you're saying, or they change the subject. So to give an example from further up the slide, you could say something like, I ask that you don't use illegal drugs in the house, please. Yes, as I said, I ask that you don't use illegal drugs in the house, please. As I've already said, I ask that you don't use illegal drugs in the house, please. I'm going to have another go at saying this because I'm not sure you've heard me. I ask that you don't use illegal drugs in the house, please. Okay, let's come on to the next slide. The next idea I've got for you is a counselling skill, and this is to comment on the difference between what somebody says and what they actually do. Such as, I hear you say you'll pay the money back, and you haven't done so before. You might want to invite them to see your point of view, such as how would it be for you if I treated you that way? The next idea is just to comment on what happens in the conversation. I notice you haven't answered my question, and you may want to possibly add, and I'm curious what is stopping you. When something needs to be agreed, it's important that you make a clear agreement. And sometimes I work with family members who actually have written things down and ask the person who's using substances to actually sign that to say that they have agreed that. Might sound extreme, but very often people will break their agreements, or they will deny that they made them. And then lastly, you may well want to ask for things to be put right, things to be paid for them to say sorry. Now let's just say a little bit about people saying sorry. You'll need to decide whether that's enough for you. And it's important to remember that actions speak louder than words. So what I mean by that is someone very good at saying sorry, they say it all the time, but their behaviour doesn't actually change. Okay, I hope there was something in there that interests you and that looks hopeful. Or maybe you're sitting there thinking that all looks too difficult, or the other person just won't sit down and talk with me. Or perhaps worse still, you even feel frightened by the prospect of having to do or say those things. So therefore, I'd like to come on and just give you one last slide to share some ideas about what if that's all too difficult or you think it just won't work. The first point I'd make is that like any skill, communication needs to be practiced before we get good at it, and we don't need to be perfect. So please allow yourself time to develop and practice the ideas and to give them a go. To help you practice, you might want to rehearse what to say before you actually need to say it, And perhaps you might want to do that in front of a mirror to see how you come across, or to perhaps do that with a friend who can give you some feedback. If needs be, fake it to make it. It's okay if you feel anxious and you don't feel assertive. You can still say what you want to say, even if you have to fake it. Also, you might want to consider writing them a letter, an email or a text, rather than speaking face to face. If that feels easier, perhaps less scary, or if you imagine there's more chance of them actually hearing you. Next, it's really important to say that you keep yourself safe. So if you feel fearful of the other person, then perhaps the ideas I'm offering here are the right thing at the wrong time. If that is the case, or if you're just having difficulty communicating with someone, then I'd really want to encourage you to get the support that you might need. And in particular, I propose that you look at session number 10, when we'll be looking at family arguments and conflicts. And also, if you feel unsafe because of aggression from your loved one, please seek professional support. I'd like to end the session by just posing some questions for you to consider. Firstly, think about what is it important for you to say to them, and then to think about how might you say that to them, and perhaps using some of the ideas that I've offered in this session. Also, I think it would be useful to consider, how do you imagine they'll respond to you, and then how would you deal with that? Again, perhaps using the ideas that I've offered in this session. And then lastly, as ever, I want to end by just encouraging you to look elsewhere on the Adfam website for sources of support in your area. Okay, that concludes session number 7. Bye now.